Why do hearing people look at sign language as such a burden? Like, that is something that I will never understand. Why do deaf people constantly have to be the ones to conform to a hearing society? A lot of people have never even been exposed to a deaf person. That should tell you something. If there is not opportunities to learn about deaf people, people will continue to be ignorant towards deaf people.
No such thing as a life that's better than yours. No such thing as a life that's better than yours. No such thing, no such thing.
Jumbo everyone, welcome back to my channel, and in today's video I'm going to be asking kind of like a survey question that I came up with after watching a documentary in one of my deaf culture classes. So let's get started. Before we actually get into this video, a couple things to talk about. Yes, we are on a different camera currently, hopefully for not too much longer. I love my Canon T5i, but I also do love my Canon M100 and the way that it blurs the background, makes me look good. And sorry if I'm looking over here in the viewfinder, I'm not used to it being over here. I'm used to it being up top, and I'm also trying to make sure that the video stays in focus because sometimes with this lens it doesn't want to stay in focus, but fingers crossed. Anyways, I just had to say that real quick. So let's really get into the video. Two definitions we have to know before actually getting into this video is ableism and autism. The definition of ableism is, and I have my computer sitting right here. The definition of ableism is a discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines people by their disability. And then the definition for autism is discrimination or prejudice against individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. Just had to go over those two definitions real quick just so you guys can really understand where I'm coming from when it comes to the questions that I'm going to pose within this video. The reason why I wanted to make this video in the first place was because of a documentary that I watched called Sound and Fury. It is basically a documentary about two cousins. There's a little girl, her name's Heather, and she's 6 years old when she asks her parents essentially for a cochlear implant. If you don't know what a cochlear implant is, it's basically a surgery that deaf people go through, deaf children mostly, or people who have just lost their hearing. They go through this surgery in order to restore their hearing in a sense. The younger you get the surgery, the better it is for your speech, the hearing device to be, what's the word, catered to you essentially, and also I guess just better in a sense if you get it earlier, right? So Heather is very young, she's at the age of 6, and she asked her parents to get a cochlear implant. On the other hand, mind you, Heather's parents are deaf. They were born deaf, they're culturally deaf, they're in the deaf community. There's also another thing with little d versus big D. Little d is essentially you're deaf medically. So, you know, you're born deaf, you could be little d, all that other stuff. But to become capital D, you kind of have to be immersed in the deaf community. That's kind of what sets you apart from little d and big D. So basically, Heather is considered big D and her cousin Peter is considered little d. Peter is born deaf, but his parents are hearing, and his parents also happen to be related to Heather's family. Heather's father and Peter's father are brothers, so they're cousins in a sense. I know this is really confusing. We're getting there. So Peter is a twin, and Peter's twin was born hearing, but he was born deaf. And what also makes this so much more interesting is that Peter, his mom was a coda. And if you don't know what a coda is a child of a deaf adult. So it's essentially, she knows sign language, she is an interpreter, she is involved in the deaf community, but it's like so quickly you want your child to be hearing. And that's where it raised like this really big rift between the family because Heather wanted it at such a young age, but she felt like she was being pressured by her grandparents and her other side of the family to get the cochlear implant, and her parents were just like, all right, we're not going to do this. We're going to move to Maryland, which is essentially where Gallaudet was started. Has reasonably, I'd say probably one of the biggest deaf communities in the US. So they stay in Maryland for about a year, but it ultimately ends up being too much on the family and they move back. Once they move back, the same issues arise, and it's still this debate on Heather should get a cochlear implant, Heather should get a cochlear implant. At the end of the documentary, it kind of leaves us with a little bit of, well, what happened after? I'm not sure if you can find the 6 years later online somewhere. I know that like I watched it through a portal through my school, but you can watch the documentary just on YouTube alone. So that's, you know, to get a better understanding. So then it goes 6 years later. Mind you, this was all happening in, I would say, like the early 90s or like the mid 90s to like the early 2000s. So it's like cochlears are still fairly new new, but it's like not really favored within the deaf community. So 6 years later, Heather is now, I think, around like 11, 12 years old, and she did end up getting the cochlear implant. They all talk about how it's so great and all this other stuff, and it just like, obviously I'm hearing, right? I don't get to have an opinion. It just rubs me the wrong way how much the grandma pushed for her to get this cochlear implant. And now it shows, you know, within the documentary, the 6 years later, it shows like how well she's doing, how she's basically immersed in the hearing world. She has hearing friends, like they still do sign language and all this other stuff. Also, her mom got the cochlear implant. Her two brothers got the cochlear implant. So like, it seemed like after Heather got the cochlear implant, everybody was kind of influenced to then get it. So it kind of turned into this whole thing, but the dad never got it. And my professor for my deaf culture class, she brought up a really good point. What she was basically saying at the end of the second documentary is that Heather and her grandma are having a conversation, and her grandma's just like, we could never have done this before. And like, take example at the end when they were baking a cake, her grandma was telling her the directions and Heather was turned around and she's like, just saying stuff that's very passive aggressive, like, I never would have been able to do this if you didn't get the cochlear implant. It would have taken us twice as longer. I would have had to sign to you and this and this and that. And to me, I'm just like, why do hearing people look at sign language as such a burden? Like, that is something that I will never understand. It's just like the grandma in the film just rubbed me the wrong way and like was being very like autism, or just examples of autism, of just so much prejudice against the deaf community and the deaf culture. And you have a deaf child, she wants cochlear implant, get her that cochlear implant now. So that's where I'm just like, this posed a very interesting question. I came up with a survey question that I wanted to ask my coworkers to then come back to class, ask them, and then kind of have a little bit of a discourse around it. So the question was similar to the title of this video, is boiling down to it, would you raise your child deaf or would you raise your child hearing? But it's a little bit deeper than that. There's two answers you can answer to, but the basis is, if you gave birth to a deaf child, what would you do? A, immerse them into the deaf community, have them essentially grow up being deaf, have a deaf identity, be culturally deaf. Or, and later down the line, if they want, they can get the cochlear implant, that's all up to them. Or would you get them the cochlear implant when they're young, when they don't have a say, put them in speech therapy, put them through oral speech, oh my god, put them through speech and oral therapy, and just like essentially raise them as a hearing person. I think with not knowing too much education about the deaf community, a lot of people will be like, yeah, I get them the cochlear implant, I want them to hear. I don't want them to have to like suffer with being deaf. So when I asked that question, it was kind of like 50-50. I would say more so like 65-35. A lot of my coworkers said that they would raise their child deaf, they would learn ASL, they would immerse them in the deaf community, all that other stuff. My other coworkers, they were kind of like defensive about it almost, and they were almost like, I wouldn't want my child to be deaf. Do you know how hard it is to be deaf? All that they're missing out on this, and this. And I'm just like, how can you miss out on something that you've never experienced before? You know what I mean? Like, there's so many deaf people where they're like, I don't care about music because I can't hear it. So it's like, how am I supposed to care about something that isn't made for me? In a sense, you know what I mean? And music could definitely be made for deaf people with the bass booming and all that other stuff, but if there isn't access to interpreters, to people to, you know, fully allow them to grasp what is going on, then that's not full access, and which I think is just unfair. So that's kind of the two questions that I asked. Would you raise your child deaf or would you raise them hearing? And it was very interesting to see people's points of views, because even like some people at first, they said cochlear implant, and then they were like, no, I want to raise them like within the deaf community. And then, you know, vice versa. Like, it was really something to think about, and that's what I like doing. I like making people think, because at the end of the day, it's like, genuinely, what would you do? And that's why I'm like, are you ableist? Do you genuinely believe that deaf people are not happy with the way that they are? Like, do you not see the rich community that they have? And that's where it's like, that's why I wanted to ask that question. Personally, what I would do, y'all already know I am going to school to become an ASL interpreter. Why wouldn't I raise my child deaf? You know what I mean? I would immerse them in the deaf community. They would grow up having a deaf identity, deaf culture, all that other stuff. Hopefully, you know, with me already knowing their language, it would be easy to communicate with them, have a bond with them, all that other stuff. So that's just kind of like the route that I would go. And that's why I asked the question, because it's just so interesting to me. You can grow up being a coda, you can grow up having deaf parents, but like, if you're presented with your child being deaf, you would immediately think to fix them to be just like you. And that's just, ugh. For my deaf culture class, we had to read a book called Words Made Flesh, and essentially it was talking about the history of deaf culture, how Gallaudet came to be Gallaudet, how a lot of the fight for deaf history was, I guess, presented within the book, one of the main topics that stayed with me was oralism versus manualism. And essentially, oralism is forcing deaf children to speak, use English, and no usage of sign language, and strictly to try to be as close to a hearing person as possible, right? Then there's manualist. Manualist is essentially teaching deaf children sign language, teaching them education through sign language, and kind of like building that culture around being deaf. There are essentially, I'd say, 4 people at the fight of it. There's Gallaudet and Clerk, who are the founders of Gallaudet, and then there's Mann and Howe. Those people are oralists, and they essentially said that deaf people don't like being deaf. They need to be hearing. They need to be teaching English to them. Like, it was just like, reading it just made like me cringe, because I'm like, wow, like the eugenics movement, Darwinism, like this all plays a part in how people portray and perceive the deaf community. So they were basically just saying that like deaf people needed to be taught English, and that deaf people didn't like being deaf even though they weren't deaf, which didn't really make any sense to me. One of the main reasons why oralism wouldn't even work in the first place is because of how it's not natural to deaf people. Deaf people with being deaf don't hear certain ways that the words are pronounced when coming out. So obviously there's a thing called like a deaf accent, and these are for deaf people who are oral and they sign, or just strictly oral or whatever. There's always going to be some type of deaf accent in a way, unless they've, have gotten a cochlear implant when they're super young and they're able to pick up on, all that other stuff. But there's a deaf accent when it comes to teaching deaf kids how to talk, because they don't hear how words are pronounced. Obviously, that's how we learn how to talk. We hear something, we repeat it. That's how it works. So that's where it's also just like trying to force deaf people to talk and to be like hearing is not natural to them. What is natural is sign language, using facial expressions, really expressing themselves, instead of being taught to do something that isn't even natural to their mother tongue. I don't know why it's always trying to take disabled people and make them into normal people. What confuses me so much with like this oralist mindset is trying to deprive deaf people of a language, a community, a culture, all that stuff, to make them hearing, even though hearing people will always make it known that they will never be hearing. So that's where I'm just like, why don't we just leave people alone and let them do what they want in their own community instead of trying to change that community? Like I said, within the book, it talks about how it doesn't make any sense to use years and years and years worth of time that could be used to teach deaf people ASL and then teach them education through ASL. Instead, they're using those years to learn how to talk, learn how to properly hear, learn how to just be hearing when they're not hearing. That shit makes no fucking sense to me. And it just makes me beg the question so many times. Why do deaf people constantly have to be the ones to conform to a hearing society? Why? Why don't we just learn ASL? And that's also another point that I want to bring up. A lot of people, I did a poll on my Instagram, a lot of people have never even been exposed to a deaf person. That should tell you something. If there is not opportunities to learn about deaf people, people will continue to be ignorant towards deaf people. In Minnesota alone, there's over 1.5 million people who have lost their hearing or are deaf. 900,000 of those people need devices in order to hear. There are only 400 interpreters in Minnesota. Does that not say something? Does that, like, you know what I mean? How is there so many people that need access to interpreters to really understand what is going on, just to be involved in the hearing community so bad, and to have enough access where it actually counts as access? Instead, there's literally only 400 interpreters in Minnesota, and it went from 900 to 400 over COVID. So, and a lot of people retired, a lot of people just quit the field. Like, you see what I mean? There is a need for interpreters, yet in the city of Minneapolis, there's only one high school that offers an ASL class and the rest don't. How are people supposed to know that they have a passion in something if it's never presented to them? I know that, like, when I took my first ASL class in high school, I was like, oh, I know I want to major in this in some type of way in high school. I thought with going to the U of M, Twin Cities, they were going to have that. I stayed there for 3 years, wasting my time doing a major that I didn't even want to do. In turn, I'm now at St. Kate's and I love school. Am I tired? Yes. Am I doing everything that I can do as a college student in order to survive? Yes. But all I know is that within these next 2 years, I'm going to learn so much of not only about myself, but about the deaf community in order to properly serve them. And that's what I'm excited for. I'm excited to become an interpreter. For real, for real. There is an issue when it comes to deaf education and deaf access. This is something that I've been talking about, especially in the video that I made where I talked about the University of Minnesota being ableist. We're still talking about the same thing. This is why I transferred schools in order to actually learn the language, actually be able to become like somewhat of an advocate for the deaf community. If nobody's talking about it, I will. So please let me know down below what your answer would be. I'm very curious because it really makes you think. Would you A, raise your child to be deaf, learn ASL, immerse them in the deaf community, or would you raise them hearing, get them the cochlear implant, and have them basically have a hearing identity? It's hard, I know. So that was today's video. I know a lot of discourse, usually a little bit controversial because that's how I like to be, but I just like to have people think, like, what would you do? I'm John Quinones. What would you do? Y'all know me. We're going into week 7 of school. I'm learning a lot. I just can't wait to be able to look back at these videos that, you know, where I've been showing my journey with the deaf community and learning ASL and becoming an interpreter and all that type of stuff. And I'm just very excited to see where I'm at in 2 years' time with being able to finally be fully fluent in ASL and continuing to get better every single day. Anyways, I think that's enough yapping for today. I hope y'all enjoyed this video and I'll see you on my next one. Bye, y'all.
Can you lead me to the ark was the last word? I need